In the autumn of 1941, as German armies carved their way across the Soviet Union and Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps dominated the North African desert, the Reich stood at the height of its power. From Norway to Libya, from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow, Nazi Germany controlled the largest empire Europe had seen since Napoleon. Yet in the war rooms and command posts scattered across this vast theatre, a quiet dread was beginning to take hold among those officers trained to think strategically, to calculate tonnages and divisions, to measure wars not in battles won, but in resources expended. When news reached German headquarters that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Adolf Hitler made what many of his generals privately considered a catastrophic miscalculation. He declared war on the United States. For Hitler, raised on memories of American isolationism and convinced of Aryan superiority, the decision seemed almost trivial. America was an ocean away, a mongrel nation of jazz music and capitalism, surely no match for the disciplined Wehrmacht that had conquered France in 6 weeks. But among the professional soldiers of the German officer corps, men who had studied military history and understood the arithmetic of industrial warfare, the reaction was markedly different. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Armed Forces Operations Staff, reportedly told colleagues that Germany had just lost the war. It was not a matter of if, but when. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, for all his loyalty to Hitler, understood that Germany had now positioned itself against the combined industrial might of the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States simultaneously. The mathematics were impossible. The German High Command's initial assessment of American military capability was steeped in prejudice and dated intelligence. During the First World War, American troops had been seen as enthusiastic but poorly trained, dependent on French and British equipment and leadership. The interwar years had shown an America devoted to isolationism, its military ranked smaller than Portugal's, its army equipped with obsolete weapons and antiquated doctrine. German intelligence reports from the late 1930s described the United States Army as negligible, a constabulary force suited to breaking strikes, not fighting modern wars. This contempt extended to cultural assumptions. Nazi ideology painted Americans as a weak, racially mixed society devoted to comfort and entertainment, incapable of the sacrifice and discipline required for total war. The German military journal Die Wehrmacht published articles mocking American soldiers as overpaid, oversexed, and overhere, men who required ice cream and clean sheets, who would crumble at the first taste of real combat. Yet even as these assessments circulated, a handful of German officers who had visited the United States or studied American industry began expressing quiet concerns. The sheer scale of American manufacturing capacity was unlike anything in Europe. One German military attaché who had toured Detroit's automotive factories before the war filed reports that were largely ignored. He described production lines that could manufacture a complete automobile every single minute, assembly processes of unprecedented efficiency, factories that dwarfed anything in Germany. If such capacity were turned to military production, he warned, the results would be overwhelming. In early 1942, these warnings began transforming from theoretical concerns into tactical realities. The first encounters between German and American forces came in North Africa, where Rommel's veteran troops faced green American units at Kasserine Pass. The initial engagement seemed to confirm every German prejudice. American forces broke under German armored assault. Officers lost control of their units, equipment was abandoned. Rommel's after-action reports noted the Americans fought hesitantly, retreated in disorder, and demonstrated poor combined arms coordination. But Rommel, unlike Hitler, was a professional soldier who understood that initial defeats meant little in a long war. What concerned him was not the inexperience of American troops, but the quantity and quality of their equipment. Even in defeat, American units were equipped with new tanks, new trucks, new radios. Everything was fresh from the factory. Rommel had spent 2 years in North Africa learning to husband every gallon of fuel, to cannibalize broken tanks for parts, to make do with captured supplies. The Americans, he noted, simply threw material at problems. If something broke, they abandoned it and brought up a replacement. In his letters to his wife, Rommel expressed growing concern about what he was witnessing. the Americans learned quickly. Their artillery, even in early battles, was devastatingly effective, delivered with precision based on excellent communications. Their air support grew more competent with each engagement. Most troubling was the steady, relentless flow of new equipment. For every tank the Germans destroyed, two more appeared. Every battle depleted Rommel's irreplaceable veterans, while American ranks swelled with fresh divisions. By the time of the Tunisia campaign in early 1943, German commanders in North Africa were sending reports back to Berlin that painted an alarming picture. One intelligence summary noted that American units were now receiving air support on a scale that dwarfed the Luftwaffe's capacity. American artillery fired ammunition at rates that seemed impossible. A German regimental commander captured at the war's end recalled that in a single engagement, American artillery expended more shells in one afternoon than his entire regiment had been allocated for a month of operations. The psychological impact on German soldiers was profound. Veterans of the Eastern Front were accustomed to Soviet mass tactics, to waves of infantry and tanks that came regardless of losses. But the Soviet soldier often fought with obsolete equipment, with minimal support, sometimes without even adequate ammunition. The Americans fought differently. They came with overwhelming firepower, with air support on call, with artillery that could flatten square kilometers of terrain. When they advanced, they did so behind a wall of explosive force that left German defenders stunned and bleeding. German POWs captured in North Africa began telling a consistent story to interrogators. They described an enemy that fought cautiously, methodically, who refused to take risks or accept casualties when firepower could achieve the same objective. American commanders, they noted, seemed almost profligate with ammunition. Where a German battalion might plan an assault carefully to conserve scarce resources, American units simply called in artillery and airstrikes until resistance ceased. As 1943 progressed and the strategic situation deteriorated across all fronts, Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, began compiling reports on Allied industrial production. The numbers were staggering. American factories were producing aircraft at rates Speer had thought physically impossible. A German aircraft factory that produced 50 fighters per month was considered highly efficient. American plants were turning out thousands of aircraft monthly. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels that carried American supplies across the Atlantic, were being built faster than U-boats could sink them. At peak production, American shipyards launched a new Liberty ship every single day. Speer presented these figures to Hitler multiple times. He explained that Germany's entire annual steel production was being matched by American output every few months. That American aircraft production in 1943 would exceed Germany's by a factor of 4 to 1. That the Soviet Union, sustained by American Lend-Lease, was outproducing Germany in tanks and artillery, despite having lost its most industrialized territories. Hitler dismissed these reports as defeatism, as Jewish manipulation of statistics. But Speer knew, and the generals knew, what these numbers meant. The invasion of Normandy in June 1944 confronted German commanders with the full scale of American industrial and logistical capability. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of German forces in the West, watched the invasion unfold with professional horror. The Allies landed not merely troops, but entire artificial harbors, prefabricated ports that could sustain operations on open beaches. The scale of supply was unprecedented in military history. American units came ashore with levels of equipment that seemed almost absurd to German defenders. Every soldier had an automatic or semi-automatic weapon. Every unit had vehicles, radios, medical supplies in abundance. Rommel, now commanding Army Group B in France, wrote to his wife that the Allies possessed complete air supremacy, that German forces could barely move in daylight without being attacked. He noted that a single American fighter-bomber could destroy more tanks in an afternoon than German industry could replace in a week. In meetings with other commanders, Rommel spoke openly about the impossibility of the situation. Germany was fighting an enemy that could afford to fail, that could absorb losses and return stronger, while every German defeat brought the Reich closer to collapse. German junior officers fighting in the Normandy bocage came to understand these realities at ground level. Lieutenant Hans von Luck, commanding a reconnaissance battalion, later recalled the psychological impact of facing American forces. His experienced troops, veterans of Poland, France, and Russia, found themselves pinned down by artillery fire of such intensity that movement became suicidal. When they destroyed an American tank, 3 more appeared. When they ambushed an American convoy, replacement vehicles arrived within hours. The Americans, he noted, fought like men who knew they could not lose, who had the luxury of caution because time and resources were on their side. The German military had been trained in doctrines of maneuver warfare, of decisive battles and breakthrough operations. But against the Americans, such tactics became impossible. Every German offensive ran into walls of firepower. Every German defensive position was eventually obliterated by artillery and air bombardment. German commanders found themselves fighting a war of attrition they could not win, bleeding irreplaceable veterans against an enemy that seemed capable of infinite replacement. By the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces closed on the German border and the Red Army swept across Eastern Europe, the professional officers of the Wehrmacht existed in a strange psychological state. They continued to fight with skill and determination, to plan operations and contest every kilometer. But privately, in their diaries and letters, in hushed conversations between trusted colleagues, they acknowledged what propaganda denied. The war was lost. Germany was being crushed between enemies it could not match in men, material, or industrial capacity. General Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare, appointed Inspector General of the Panzer Forces in early 1944, spent the final year of the war attempting the impossible. He tried to rebuild German armored strength while Allied bombers systematically destroyed factories, rail lines, and fuel production. In meetings with Hitler, Guderian presented plans that required resources Germany no longer possessed. He requested tank production that exceeded Germany's remaining steel allocation. He asked for fuel that refineries could not produce. Most frustrating was Hitler's insistence on offensive operations, on expending Germany's last reserves in attacks that achieved nothing. The Ardennes offensive in December 1944, Hitler's final gamble in the West, demonstrated the delusion that now gripped German strategic thinking. The operation assembled Germany's last mobile reserves, its final stocks of fuel and ammunition, for a desperate thrust toward Antwerp. Professional officers like Model and Rundstedt understood the offensive could not succeed. Even if German forces reached the Meuse River, even if they somehow split Allied armies, they lacked the resources to sustain operations. The Americans would simply bring up reinforcements, call in air support once weather cleared, and methodically destroy the overextended German spearheads. German officers who fought in the Ardennes witnessed the full maturity of American military capability. The initial assaults achieved surprise, pushed back American lines, created the bulge that gave the battle its name. But within days, American reinforcements arrived in staggering numbers. Entire divisions redeployed hundreds of kilometers in trucks that German forces could only dream of possessing. American tank destroyers, initially caught off guard, appeared in numbers that blunted every German armored thrust. Most devastating was the weather clearing, allowing American air power to turn the Ardennes forests into killing grounds. A German panzer officer captured during the Ardennes later described watching American fighter bombers work. They circled overhead in formations, taking turns to dive and attack, methodical and unstoppable. His company had begun the offensive with 14 tanks. After 3 days, they had 2 operational vehicles and were out of fuel. Surrounding them in the snow were the burned-out hulks of Germany's finest tanks, destroyed not in glorious combat, but picked apart from the air, starved of fuel, overwhelmed by numbers. The psychological toll on German soldiers facing American forces manifested in ways both subtle and profound. Veteran officers noted that troops fought with resignation rather than conviction, that the legendary German combat effectiveness was sustained now by discipline and professionalism, rather than belief in victory. Soldiers knew that surrender to Americans was preferable to Soviet captivity, creating incentives to withdraw westward, to hold against the Russians while yielding to Anglo-American forces. German POWs captured by American forces consistently reported surprise at their treatment. They had been told to expect brutality, summary execution, torture. Instead, they found clean POW camps, adequate food, medical treatment, adherence to Geneva Conventions. Many German soldiers later admitted they had fought harder against the Russians not from ideological conviction, but from fear of captivity. Against Americans, particularly as the war's end became inevitable, resistance seemed increasingly pointless. Why die for a lost cause when surrender meant survival? The contrast between American and German logistical capabilities became stark in the war's final months. American units advanced across Germany, supported by supply lines that stretched back to Atlantic ports, sustained by fleets of trucks that brought fuel, ammunition, and food forward daily. German forces, retreating into their own territory, found themselves unable to supply troops from their own remaining factories. Rail lines lay destroyed by bombing, fuel production had collapsed, ammunition stocks dwindled. The German army, once the world's most mechanized force, returned to horse-drawn transport and foot marches, an industrial military dying from resource starvation. Albert Speer, in his final reports to Hitler in March 1945, stated the obvious. German industry had collapsed. The war was economically lost. Continuing resistance served no purpose except to increase civilian casualties and destruction. Hitler ignored him. But among the officer corps, Speer's assessment was accepted reality. Generals who had spent careers studying military history understood they were witnessing the death of Germany not through defeat in battle, but through industrial exhaustion. The Reich had challenged enemies possessing 10 times its steel production, 20 times its oil production, populations that dwarfed Germany's. The mathematics had always been impossible. In the war's final weeks, as American and Soviet forces carved apart the Reich, German officers faced choices between honor and pragmatism. Some fought to the end, from loyalty or ideology or simple military duty. Others sought to surrender to Americans rather than Russians, to save their men from Soviet captivity. In these final acts, the professional respect many German officers had developed for American military capability manifested clearly. They knew American forces would accept surrenders properly conducted, would treat POWs according to law, would allow German officers to retain some dignity in defeat. Field Marshal Kesselring, commanding German forces in the West during the final months, later wrote that fighting the Americans had been like facing an ocean tide. Each American attack could be resisted, sometimes even thrown back. But behind the first wave came another and another, each supported by firepower that made resistance futile. The Americans, he noted, fought with the confidence of men backed by limitless resources, who knew that time and industry were winning the war, regardless of tactical setbacks. The final reckoning came in the ruins of the Reich in May 1945. Germany, which had begun the war as Europe's industrial powerhouse, lay shattered. Its cities were rubble, its factories destroyed. Its remaining population faced starvation. Across the Atlantic, the United States emerged from the war stronger than it had entered. Its industrial capacity expanded, its military the world's most powerful, its homeland untouched by bombing or invasion. In the years following the war, as German generals wrote their memoirs and gave interviews, a consistent theme emerged. Almost uniformly, they argued that Germany had lost the war not through tactical or operational failure, but through strategic impossibility. They had been ordered to fight enemies that possessed overwhelming material advantages. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States, to force Germany into conflict against American industrial might, was identified repeatedly as the moment the war became unwinnable. Guderian, in his memoirs, calculated that American industrial production by 1944 exceeded Germany's by margins that made continued resistance militarily pointless. He noted that a single American B-24 bomber required more aluminum than Germany's entire monthly allocation for aircraft production. That American steel output in 1 month equaled Germany's production for a year. That American automotive factories produced more trucks in 1944 than Germany had manufactured in its entire history. These numbers were not excuses for defeat, though some used them as such. Rather, they represented professional military officers confronting the reality that modern warfare had become industrial warfare. The side with more factories, more resources, more capacity to produce and replace equipment held insurmountable advantages. Tactical skill and operational art could achieve local victories, but strategic exhaustion was inevitable when fighting enemies possessing such material superiority. Rommel, before his forced suicide in October 1944, had written in private correspondence that the war could only end in German defeat. He cited not German soldiers' courage or commanders' ability, but simple arithmetic. Every tank destroyed, every aircraft lost, every ship sunk brought Germany closer to collapse, while Allied losses were replaced within weeks. The mathematics of attrition favored the side that could outproduce and outlast, and America's capacity to do both was unmatched in human history. The lesson German commanders learned, taught in blood across North African deserts, Normandy hedgerows, and Ardennes forests, was that wars between industrial nations are ultimately decided by industrial capacity. Training, tactics, leadership, even ideology matter less than the ability to field and sustain armed forces over years of conflict. Germany had challenged enemies that collectively possessed resources it could not match, fighting a war it lacked the industrial base to win. In the end, the German officers who realized America could not be defeated had recognized a fundamental truth about modern warfare. Victory goes not merely to the brave or the skilled, but to those who can sustain armies in the field, who can replace losses, who can outlast opponents in grinding attritional struggles. The United States, protected by oceans, possessed of vast resources, and home to the world's most productive industrial economy, represented an enemy Germany could hurt, but never defeat. The American advantage was not primarily in tactics or technology, though both were formidable. It was in the unglamorous mathematics of logistics and production, in assembly lines that never stopped, in resource extraction that fed hungry factories, in a continental economy that could arm and sustain vast military forces while simultaneously raising civilian living standards. German generals, trained to think in terms of decisive battles and operational maneuver, found themselves fighting an enemy that won through patient accumulation of material superiority. As the last German generals surrendered in May 1945, as POW camps across Europe filled with Wehrmacht soldiers, the full scope of their defeat became clear. Germany had lost not merely battles or territory, but the fundamental calculation of industrial warfare. Against enemies that could outproduce and outlast the Reich, tactical brilliance and operational skill could only delay the inevitable. The war had been lost not in 1945, but in December 1941, when Hitler declared war on an enemy whose industrial capacity alone made German defeat certain. The recognition that America could not be defeated represented for many German officers a bitter acknowledgement of modernity's verdict. Wars were no longer decided primarily by battlefield courage or tactical genius, but by productive capacity, by industrial output, by the unglamorous but decisive advantage of superior logistics. In facing American forces, German commanders confronted an enemy that waged war with industrial efficiency, that replaced losses with mechanical precision, that demonstrated through overwhelming material superiority the fundamental lesson that modern wars are won in factories as much as on battlefields. This realization, painful as it was, represented professional military officers coming to terms with how warfare had evolved. The age of decisive battles and Napoleonic campaigns had given way to industrial attritional struggles where victory belonged to whichever side could sustain production longer. Germany had challenged such powers and lost, not through lack of courage or skill, but through simple arithmetic. The German generals who understood this grasped the essential truth that would define the remainder of the 20th century. In modern warfare, industrial capacity is military capability, and against America's unmatched productive power, no enemy could prevail through arms alone. Content is user-generated and unverified.